Good morning, good afternoon. Actually, well, wait, it is now afternoon. Um, I want to thank all of you for being here and for being with us throughout the whole series. This is our last event, and I always feel a little bit like doing this and saying, I'm so glad we've had this time together, which if you're of a certain age, you know what I'm referencing. Um, okay. Um, so it's been great having this back and having it back in real life. And we're looking forward to more things coming in the spring. Um, Before we get going, I want to do a big thank you to PSU, to Ron Witzak here, who really helped shepherd this and helped host this. I want to thank Dave and Pei, our intrepid AV folks, and Kendra with the Campus AV for helping make this possible. And Kathy Moyd, who is a wonderful member and supporter whose generous donation helped make the streaming of this and the presentation of this possible. So Kathy, if you're watching, we're all going to give you a big hand. Some things coming up to think about. Bridge Together, April 28th at the Daimler Trucks North America headquarters here, which is a spectacular place. You walk in and you'll feel like a 5-year-old because there's a big truck in the lobby and it is so cool. But they are hosting our annual fundraiser, which used to be called World Quest. Bridge Together is a little more friendly than World Quest. So we're hoping that that moves people towards more a friendly relationship and also donating to us. It is one of the only straight up fundraisers we do all year. So hope you can join us. You can do it virtually or you can be in the room. You can go to our website to find out more information on that. The other thing, you can explore Iceland with our leader, Derek Olson. There are only 3 rooms left on this incredible excursion that is happening this summer. And you can find out again more information at worldoregon.org. But if you snooze, you lose. I wish I could say that in Icelandic because I bet it sounds really cool. The other thing people always ask about around this time of year is the International Speaker Series, which we are currently developing. It is going to look different, be different, and I'm hearing myself. And will be in what's going on over there? And we'll be in a different venue than in previous years. We're looking at expanding the series to the Portland Metro. So we're looking at some other venues, some smaller venues. We want to bring you closer to the speaker and have a little bit more sense of excitement and engagement with it. So stay tuned. We hope we're going to have 2 in the spring, 2 in the fall, and it should be relevant, urgent, immediate, and particular is how I like to look at it. Very excited today. One of the great things about Great Decisions, oh, by the way, and if you haven't gotten your Great Decisions book, 50% off. Last day to get them, $17.50. Used to be $35, but for you from Good Family today only, $17.50. But one of the great things about programming this series, which I've been doing now for 13 years, is inviting new voices, new faces, new perspectives to shed light on issues that are changing, challenging our relationship with the world. So every year we get these 8 topics. I feel like I'm on a game show. Final answer. Anyway, so we get these 8 topics, and it's great to bring in new faces, new voices, new perspectives, and a new voice, a new face this year is Gina Miller-Johnson from George Fox University. She joined George Fox in 2015 after earning a BA in public relations from the University of Alabama. You will note a slight little twang in her voice, which is quite endearing. She has an MA in political science from the University of Alabama and a PhD from the University of Alabama in political science. Her teaching and research interests are in the subfield of international relations with an emphasis on political violence, and primary research interests are state repression and the impact of domestic and international institutions of human rights practices. And her dissertation research examined the use of repression against nonviolent dissidents and explores the impact of domestic institutions on state action. Very excited to have her here today to talk about something that I think is really urgent. It was great that we had the Iran discussion last week. It was a really good way to tee up this topic, which is that of economic warfare or sanctions. So big hand for Gina. Remember, when we get to Q&A, I will be walking around with the mic for your questions. Questions are 30 seconds or less, and they have question marks at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Tim. And it's such an honor to be here with you today. It is wonderful that we can have these types of academic discussions again in person. I know that as a professor, COVID was really challenging because it's really hard to connect with students, but just really connect with people on Zoom. But for those people on Zoom, I'm so glad that also you're able to be here as well. Tim was mentioning this topic being relevant. And so while I won't focus exclusively on sanctions as it pertains to Russia, there's a lot of developments in the news, even this morning, where the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Putin. We also see China planning a meeting, Xi Jinping planning a meeting, visiting Moscow next week for a few days. So some of these topics are certainly relevant as we think about, will sanctions work, will economic warfare work to curb Russia's aggression toward Ukraine. So today I'm going to be, there we go, presenting a little bit more information than what was in the Jonathan Chanis reading, but I will be drawing from much of what he included as well. I don't want to just restate what he included, but in the description, it asked, how effective will sanctions be in curbing Russia's aggression? So I'll kind of end with an analysis and my thoughts on that based on some of the empirical data that I will present to you today. So I just want to start with a brief review, a modern history of economic warfare, very brief, touch on some of the classifications that Chanis provided in the reading, touch on a couple of his review the critiques, and then in this empirical evaluation section, I'll present some more recent data in the past 4 years, what some of the literature on economic sanctions effectiveness provides for us, and hopefully use that to analyze the question, how effective will sanctions be in curbing Russia's aggression? So just to start with the modern history, I'm drawing a lot, or exclusively really, from a book by Nicholas Mulder that was just released in 2022. It was actually nominated as a foreign affairs, or selected as a foreign affairs best book of 2022. And he's a professor of history. Oh, that's certainly fine. A professor of history at Cornell University. So want to give him credit for this summary of the 20th century history of sanctions. So what's interesting about the 20th century is it's the first time that we see sanctions, economic warfare, go from being a wartime institution to a peacetime institution. And so sanctions were applied in World War I to devastating effect. Hundreds of thousands of people, especially in Central Europe and in the Middle East, died from disease or famine, and there were numerous developmental and what we might consider human development indicators that were affected by the disease and the famine. If you just think about a malnourished mother giving birth to a malnourished child, that's going to affect development, and that's going to carry on for generations and have generational effects. It was so extreme that there were many people, even in the West, during World War I, that were lobbying against the use of what was called at this time by diplomats and policymakers the economic weapon. But this was still something that was generally used only in wartime. It was a tool of war. After the end of World War I, the liberal institutionalists, those people like Woodrow Wilson, who advocated for more collective cooperation in international affairs, wanted to utilize this economic weapon in peacetime. So what we see in the interwar years is that sanctions being another term for economic warfare, the economic weapon, they become a peacetime deterrent, a tool that people like Wilson were very optimistic could deter aggressor states from engaging in aggressive behavior because they wanted to avoid this devastating isolation. And so almost in the same breath, Woodrow Wilson calls sanctions both peaceful and deadly. I'll just read you one quote. I promise it'll be the only quote of my presentation. But he's called them something more tremendous than war. He goes on to say they threaten an absolute isolation that brings a nation to its senses, just as suffocation removes from the individual all inclinations to fight. Apply this economic, peaceful, silent, deadly remedy, and there will be no need for force. It is a terrible remedy. It does not cost a life outside of the nation boycotted, but it brings a pressure upon that nation, which in my judgment, no modern nation could resist. So this is really telling that it was seen as something that someone like Wilson, who wanted to outlaw war, would use, but also referencing it as a deadly weapon in the same breath. Nonetheless, even despite its deadly effects, the League of Nations codifies sanctions as an economic peacetime weapon, if you will, into Article 16 of the League's covenant. So this becomes, again, a peacetime tool, much like we might think of the United Nations giving the Security Council the authorization to use sanctions. The League of Nations, for those who aren't familiar, is a precursor to the UN. And so that Article 16 codifies sanctions as a peacetime deterrent. Also, we see that states, particularly powerful Western states like the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, increase their interference in global economic exchange and communication during this time. And it almost has to be so if we're going to use sanctions as a way to censor or deter potential aggressor states, then sanctioning states like the United States, France, the UK, need to be able to interfere in this dense network of trade, of finance, of knowledge, and information sharing. So we see a much increased use of state interference in the global economy at this time. We also see potential aggressor states trying to make themselves sanction resilient. I think the word was blockade resilient. So another impact or another outcome in the interwar years, as we see that sanctions start to reinforce nationalism in places like Italy and Germany and Japan, and autarky, which is just this effort to develop economic self-sufficiency, not need to rely on any other outside source for economic development and provision of goods. So while I'm not sure that Japan would not have had imperial ambitions, or Hitler would not have had imperial ambitions, even if sanctions weren't in place, we can certainly trace at least some of Japan's interest in attacking the United States to its fear of being cut off from global oil supplies. So Roosevelt had sanctioned Japan, cut them off from receiving oil. Again, Japan being an island, and there's not much with limited territory, there aren't many resources. So this was an existential crisis for Japan. Now, I'm not saying that they wouldn't have had imperialist ambitions and attacked Pearl Harbor if it hadn't been for sanctions, but it certainly didn't make them feel more at ease with the future and their future existence. Roosevelt also wanted us to enter World War II. So who knows, he may have disregarded any potential aggression that sanctions against Japan could have caused. He may have been aware that this would have made them more aggressive. But nonetheless, we see economic sanctions putting a pressure on challenger states like Germany and Japan, and potentially having, what's the word I'm looking for here, an aggravating effect on global tensions at the time. Now, at this time, There was another option. Instead of maybe a negative economic weapon, there was a positive economic weapon, two sides of the same coin. Instead of just sanctioning, let's say, Italy because of their aggression toward Ethiopia, another means of sanctions were what were called a positive economic weapon. And that would be providing resources to a state like Ethiopia that was under attack or under aggression by Italy. So this was not utilized very much in the interwar years, but the US in particular starts to use this positive economic weapon to counter German and Japanese influences. So this could still have aggravating effects as well. We think about the US providing weapons assistance and money to Ukraine right now. That's the positive economic weapon that's providing them assistance. This can still aggravate a challenger state like Russia, but it doesn't need to have necessarily the same humanitarian concerns that we'll talk about in a little bit as a total blockade might have. Again, as I mentioned, sanctions, or states' use of sanctions increased the state's hand in the global economy. And so states had to have an increasing repertoire of methods for applying sanctions. Just think about how technology would change that in the late 1900s. No, getting that right. Let's just say the end of World War I in 1919. It wouldn't have made sense to put a ban on Soviet airlines flying into the US like we might use right now. One of the sanctions against Russia is that the Russian airline can come into US airspace. But the technology was not there, or the widespread use of different developing technologies was not there. So as the years have progressed, we've seen this increasing repertoire of methods, from travel bans to things like bans on asset freezes in the global financial system. So we've seen this increasing proliferation of the different types of sanctions. So with that, I just want to turn to the reading in the booklet by Jonathan Chanis, and he mentions these different classifications. I'll explain the headline that I have included here, but Chanis gives us a few different classifications where we can discuss, or how we can discuss sanctions. Because if we're thinking, or we're asking the question, are sanctions effective or will sanctions work, we probably need to break that apart and think, well, what do we mean by sanctions? What type of sanctions are we discussing? So he gives us this dichotomy, if you will, of a conventional versus extraordinary. This could be considered those that are widely used versus those that are a bit more rare. When I'm looking at his typology of extraordinary sanctions, though, they seem like these might be rare, but also may involve more physical force. So, for example, sabotaging national infrastructure, that was considered an overt, very visible, extraordinary measure of sanctions. That second category, overt versus covert, the visibility versus that might be harder to detect, right? So spyware targeting a government's infrastructure via technology like the US did with Iran would be more of a covert type of sanction. Now, I didn't really know where to put this one. I'm not necessarily saying this is definitive, but I found this very interesting. This was from the Helsinki Times, a newspaper out of Finland, that was citing an investigative journalist saying that the US and Norway were responsible for blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and cited some statements by the Biden administration around this time last year before the invasion of Ukraine, where Biden was commented a couple of times by saying that if Russia invades Ukraine, there will be no more Nord Stream 2, or it will have some type of negative outcome on the development of Nord Stream 2. There was other information in this investigative report, but the Helsinki Times here was just reporting on this. To me, this would be an extraordinary use of sanctions involving physical force. You have to use some type of military capability to carry this out. I wasn't sure where to put it, overt or covert. It's certainly visible. Everybody was made aware of it, but it was also something that the US denied. So it could kind of fall in between, trying to do it plausibly deniable. The last category here, the offensive versus defensive, by nature, most sanctions are offensive sanctions. We're trying to change another state's behavior, induce some change through the threat or use of sanctions. But Chanis mentions how we may try to reduce our own vulnerability to sanctions by others in a defensive manner. So he mentions a few ways the U.S. is doing this in anticipation of perhaps China imposing some sanctions on the U.S., economic sanctions on the U.S. So some of the critiques that Chanis mentions, I think, are those that even though I am not in this literature and I don't study it myself, I've taught enough foreign policy classes to be a bit familiar with some forms of economic sanctions and economic warfare. And so one of the critiques in the debates in the literature concern the effectiveness of sanctions. And as I mentioned, if we're going to evaluate effectiveness, we have to ask, what do we mean by sanctions? What types of sanctions are we looking at here? We have to define those categories, but we also have to ask, what do we mean by effectiveness? Is effectiveness total acquiescence? So would the US sanctions against Russia be effective only if there was a complete withdrawal from Ukraine and a secession of all territory, including the Crimea, back to Ukraine? Or is effectiveness measured more as partial concessions or some type of negotiated settlement? In the literature, most of the studies that I looked at measure effectiveness in their empirical analysis to be partial concessions or some type of negotiated settlement would count as a success, not just total acquiescence. So what we see, the data report on effectiveness, depends on how you measure that variable. So I'll present some information, some literature about effectiveness, as well as about humanitarian concerns. Now, this is one that we hear a lot about as well, and I mentioned and began with talking about the hundreds of thousands of lives lost because of this total blockade put on the Central Powers and their territories in World War I. So it is a very legitimate concern. I have constitutional concerns kind of grayed out here because I'm not going to touch on that, but Chanis does, and I appreciate that he included this. The sanctions regime, which is probably highly preferred by leaders, it's easier probably to sign off on sanctions than it is to sign off on a bombing campaign, let's say. So once you start using sanctions, there's going to be a bureaucracy that develops around it. There are going to be ways in which perhaps presidential powers can avoid getting legislative approval for it. So there are a number of concerns that we should have about overuse of sanctions and how this may be, another kind of bureaucratic nightmare, or there could be bureaucratic incentives, let's just say. So I'm going to move into just the literature on effectiveness of sanctions here. So one study found that sanctions effectiveness is contingent on features of the targeted state. By targeted state, we mean Russia, the state that is being sanctioned. So whether or not sanctions are effective tends to, according to a few studies, tends to depend on the regime type. And so we have to also probably talk about how regime types are determined and classified as well. But I'll just present what Pexon in his 2019 piece in Defense and Peace Economics, a journal, and I'll have my sources at the end. So if anybody's interested in following up or reading more, I can provide those. But he finds that sanctions are less likely to be effective against single-party regimes and military regimes, and more likely to be effective against democracies and personalist regimes. Now, I'll give you a little information about how these are classified, because if you go onto Google right now and you Google the word personalist regime, I did this, and you'll get probably the top 10 articles have something to do with Putin and his growing personalist dictatorship. If you read the studies that Pexon and others have done in the comparative politics literature, Russia doesn't necessarily fit the personalist regime definition. It fits better in the single party regime. So in a personalist regime, we think of those like the regime of Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti, Idi Amin in Uganda, Perón in Argentina, where one individual controls policymaking, one individual controls even personnel decisions. There's a very small group of supporters. There's oftentimes a personal protective agency, a personal band of guards around that individual. And it's highly, the legitimacy of that leader derives a lot from personal characteristics. I think that people in Haiti believed that Papa Doc Duvalier and his circle of guards had some particular powers to make people disappear. And so this kept people quite fearful of him and kept him in power. So that's what we tend to classify as a personalist regime. Those regimes don't tend to have very much institutional capacity. So meaning that the leadership maintains power on a delicate balance. And there is not much state capacity to weather the impact of economic sanctions. So we may not have, the leader may not have the ability to, for example, move resources away from one part of the government or the state and direct them toward a coalition of supporters, for example, to weather the economic sanctions. For a single party regime, this is usually refers to a regime that, like in Russia, one party tends to dominate, but that party has a lot of historical or bureaucratic strength, a lot of administrative strength. It doesn't mean that no other parties compete in elections. It doesn't mean that no other parties exist, but one party tends to dominate. One party tends to select people for different bureaucratic positions. And military regimes, a group of officers rule, set policy decisions, and make personnel decisions. So we could debate a little bit about where Russia falls here. It may be moving on a continuum more to that personalist category, but generally it fits, in my assessment at least, the single party authoritarian regime. Putin has a lot of sway, but the party apparatus is also rather powerful as well. If he died tomorrow, there is probably some type of method for succession. In a personalist regime, that's unlikely to be the case. The country would likely descend into a fight for that leader's position. Other examples of a single part, another example of a single party regime would be, for example, the Syrian regime, where the Ba'ath Party under the Assad family has reigned for quite some time. Other factors that may affect the effectiveness of sanctions include whether or not those sanctions are multilateral or unilateral. So multilateral would be those coming from the UN or a coalition of states. Unilateral would be those that the United States applies unilaterally. Alliances, so sanctions seem to be more effective if they're applied against an ally, which is interesting. I'm not sure of many instances where we see allies sanctioning one another, but I'm sure that they exist. Issue salience, so the more salient the issue, I think Chanis mentions this. He provides some information on salience of issues and notes that human rights violations are more likely to, or sanctions are more likely to be effective in stopping human rights violations, less so over territorial conflict. Unfortunately, in the scope of geopolitics, human rights abuses don't tend to be the most salient, at least for policymakers and leaders of countries. How much the sanctions pose economic costs for the regime's support group or the group that is supporting the offensive policy matters for sanctions effectiveness. That's pretty intuitive. The more economic costs that you can bring to bear with sanctions, the greater their effectiveness. And then again, the type of sanction. There does not seem to be much difference in some of the literature, doesn't find much difference between those that are highly targeted, pinpointing, for example, asset freezes on Russian oligarchs versus kind of more of the conventional total economic boycotts or blockades. But one type of targeted sanction that seems to be effective is restrictions on access to global banking activity. The financial sanctions tend to seem to have some rate of success relative to the conventional sanctions. These also seem to be more effective unilaterally when measured based on the United States imposing them, because the US controls so much access to global financial systems. So there aren't really other sources of global financing that are palatable for many sanctioned states. Some possible unintended consequences of sanctions. In their effective, they might be effective, but they might produce some less desirable results. So there's an interesting study that says we may see increased support for incumbent autocrats. That's Vladimir Putin. He is a ruling autocrat, and this makes sense. He can blame any negative economic downturn, even if it's the result of his own choice for war, on the United States or on UN sanctions. And he can rally support around this nationalistic call. He can say it's the West against us. It always has been. Think of the Cold War. He can call up historical memory. We see that sanctions may produce reciprocal sanctioning, where you have this race to the bottom of trying to out-sanction the other. So if the US sanctions Russia, then they sanction back. Never a good race to the bottom. And then closer relationships with other countries. So we see Russia developing closer ties with China, with Iran, even some cooperation with Saudi Arabia, which is Iran's enemy, nemesis. So it may drive countries into closer relationships that might not be good for the sanctioning country, like the United States or the Western countries. So these are things to watch out for. Also, in the closer relationships category, I think one thing that I constantly saw across the studies that I was reviewing is that there's always some creative way to avoid the sanctions, especially with powerful states like Russia and not having the buy-in of other countries, powerful countries like China. There are always going to be sources of economic options for Russia. And because of Russia's size as well, it may be able to weather the economic storm for longer, might even be able to weather the economic storm, the economic cost, longer than sanctioning states. I'm thinking those EU countries that are hurting in winter months without affordable gas and affordable energy. So just in the interest of time, I want to move along here and talk about, are sanctions humane? Certainly humanitarian concerns are paramount, I think, for most of us. It's almost kind of, they're humanitarian suffering because of what Putin's doing. Right now, oftentimes countries are sanctioning other countries to avoid or change abusive behavior. But I think with this developing repertoire of sanctions, advanced technology as well, we can identify some that may avoid civilian suffering. So here are a few. Prohibiting arms transfers seems like a straightforward one. Freezing assets, especially of powerful oligarchs, powerful supporters of the offending regime. Travel restrictions, targeting some of those elites. Sponsoring defections, especially of scientists and others who may help the state being sanctioned. Now, we could talk about some of the possible humanitarian implications of those, and if you have thoughts on that, maybe we can discuss those in the Q&A. One that I did want to talk about that I've always found highly creative is a luxury goods ban. I really like this one, although unfortunately it is used against North Korea a lot. Unfortunately, it has not worked to stem the flow of luxury goods, because you may guess who's providing luxury goods to North Korea. China. But it is, I think it is very creative. And this is censoring and sanctioning goods like alcohol, tobacco, perfume, cosmetics, leather, silk, yachts, motorcycles, precious stones, porcelain, those things that the elite in a targeted country may want to use as status symbols, even that the regime leaders like Kim Jong-un may use to keep his supporters happy, keep the military happy. So I think this has good promise, but again, it has to have that kind of multilateral buy-in of the big players or those countries that could provide these things. But it seems like data suggests that from 2006 to 2017, the Western and UN sponsored sanctions against luxury goods in North Korea has not worked to deter the flow of those goods. We also have an older study, but this was a groundbreaking study in political science circles. Reed Wood found that sanctions may increase repression in authoritarian regimes. He looks at different types. I'll just run through these rather quickly, but he mentions that multilateral sanctions actually have a bigger impact than unilateral. He's looking at UN versus US. This also makes sense because repression may result because of the threatened stability that sanctions put on a regime. Again, leaders may not be able to incentivize compliance among supporters or keep the military happy, et cetera, if they don't have access to goods, if they don't have access to foreign loans, investment, that sort of thing. And so when it's multilateral rather than unilateral, there are fewer places to go to resort, other countries to ask or beg for help. This impact of sanctions on repression seems to hold if you look at both moderate, what he categorizes as moderate and severe sanctions. So the level of severity at least doesn't really affect too much. Even multilateral, I think the only one that didn't increase repression were minor sanctions at the multilateral level. And these findings hold when he controls for other factors, include influencing repression. So that would be domestic dissent, recent economic growth, and past repression. Those have differing effects on repression. So, this may be a strike. This data may present a strike against sanctions as far as their humanitarian effects go. So just to wrap up here, I want to apply my thoughts on the effectiveness of sanctions in deterring Russia's aggression. How effective? I don't have high hopes that these sanctions are going to be very effective in deterring Russia's aggression. And I'll explain my reasoning here. So my reasons why sanctions may not be effective. I think Russia fits the category of a single party regime rather well. These regimes again have, and I didn't go into it very much into the theory behind why sanctions may not be very effective, but these regimes tend to have a lot of repressive capacity and institutional capacity to take resources to interfere in the market for one thing, to interfere in the economy, take resources from one area and divert those resources to areas that may benefit the regime's supporters. So it's easier for single party and military regimes to use the power of the state to keep key supporters happy and keep the economy going for longer, that democracies and personalist regimes may not have at their disposal for different reasons. I mentioned issue salience, also referring back to the Chanis reading where sanctions don't seem to be very effective against highly salient issues like territorial conflict. So that's another reason why I don't think Western sanctions are going to be too effective. And then alternative sources of support. We see China going to meet with Russia, with Xi Jinping meeting with Putin next week. We see even OPEC Plus in the fall choosing to up oil revenues. And so this is in collaboration with Saudi Arabia. This aided Putin in getting more oil revenue. It seems like he has alternative sources of support. And just thinking of the size of the Russian economy, there are a lot of levers he can pull to keep going and maybe even weather the sanctions longer than some EU countries might be able to. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. So we've got some questions coming in online. I'm sure there's some questions in the audience. I have the mic. I get the first question. So this last bit you talked about, China and India are reducing the effectiveness of sanctions against Moscow in many ways by increasing purchases of energy resources. So is it likely that we will see more and more countries making these kinds of detours in relation to the sanctions? And what mechanism is there to push back on that?
Well, this may not be popular to say because I know we all care about environmental issues and sustainable energy. I think if the US produced more oil and sold it as an alternative, this may avoid some of countries going to Russia or seeking to get oil from Russia. Because ultimately domestic considerations are going to matter first. So leaders in countries, even EU countries that have populations that are highly concerned about environmental considerations are going to feel the effects of high energy costs in an unhappy population. So those leaders are going to capitulate at some point, in my estimation, to keep domestic publics happy and to keep their job, ultimately to keep their job. Leaders care about staying in power, having their party in power. And so one way might be to have the US produce more energy, and this would include drilling, this would include potentially having to expand the Keystone Pipeline. The one positive of that is the US produces oil cleaner than other countries can do it. So if we're limiting our own oil drilling and production, what we're really just doing is kicking it over to Saudi Arabia that doesn't do it as cleanly as the US. So I know it's not popular to talk about, but that might be one solution.
I'm first going to confess that I didn't do my homework and read the article. So if I'm asking a question that was covered, I apologize.
I'm a professor, so I'm used to that.
No,
Don't worry
okay.
about it.
All right. And I was a bad student, so we're good. You've talked about everything that doesn't work. What are the elements of the sanctions against apartheid? And what lessons might be learned as to rendering future practice more effective?
That's a great question. My assessment of the South African apartheid sanctions, so these were sanctions that were overwhelmingly supported in the US Congress in the 80s, also had a lot of multilateral support. My evaluation of those is that they had little to do, they were not the main driver behind the end of apartheid. I have not, in full confession, studied this extensively, but I have done some research as part of a previous class I taught at George Fox, that there is inconclusive evidence that the international sanctions had a major role in the end of apartheid. There was a lot of international condemnation, so sanctions may have been symbolic and played a role as well. I think the economy of South Africa was already on a downturn, so perhaps international economic sanctions sped it along, but the domestic economy itself was failing, and the international movement supporting the resistance and supporting importantly, supporting the nonviolent groups trying to change, seem to have, in my evaluation, played a big role in the international sanctions. I, though, understand, and I also understand the US government not wanting to support the Russian regime, not wanting to support the National Party in South Africa in the 80s. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't sanction. I'm just not sure there's a whole lot of evidence to suggest that they were a primary factor.
So we've got two questions that are somewhat related here. I'm going to try and mash them up together. Is there any literature that distinguishes the relative effectiveness of hard economic sanctions from the boycott of artists, academics, oligarchs, or forbidding athletes, say tennis players from Russia or Belarus, from competing in certain international events?
So the questions are asking are international boycotts that might be softer, right? Such as what we might consider maybe diplomatic boycotts, social boycotts. I don't know of any literature. I'm going to put my sources, the primary sources here on the screen. These might be great starting points for trying to find more information on whether or not these softer forms of less economic boycotts, we'll just call them diplomatic boycotts, are effective. Actually did have a paper a few years ago with some co-authors that drew from psychology, social psychology, and looks at the importance of social benefits of belonging. So this is drawing from literature that would say we all have a need to belong, and this helps us understand why people join gangs, why people join terrorist groups, etc., but also why people join things that are more positive than those. We don't want to be ostracized. We don't want to be outcast. And so there was we found some evidence that losing membership in intergovernmental organizations has a negative impact on states' human rights records. So if you lose membership for any reason, the theory goes, we think that maybe you're less likely to comply with international standards of behavior. So this may speak a little bit to the power of diplomatic boycotts, that maybe states are sensitive to their reputation. And even Woodrow Wilson, I'm not sure I have the quote here, but he felt that sanctions had a powerful sociological impact as well. Just the idea that you're isolated and cut off from the world is powerful enough to change behavior. So those diplomatic sanctions may be a powerful tool in some cases. It probably is going to depend on how widespread multilateral that boycott is. And so that's why I think maybe some sanctions against South Africa were widely accepted. I think they were, I forget which, I want to say a Latin American country refused to play soccer in the World Cup against South Africa because of apartheid, but I can't remember. So some effect may have some kind of negative effect on the leaders, but I'm not sure if the issue is as salient as territorial aggrandizement. I'm sorry. I hope I explained my thoughts there clearly enough.
Thank you for an excellent presentation.
thank
So well organized.
Oh, thank you.
In the article we read today, there's a chart or a graph that shows which types of sanctions are most effective. And it looks like number 2 is human rights. So my question is, do we have sanctions specifically against China regarding the Uyghurs? And if so, are they national or international? Are there others who've joined in that?
To my knowledge, we do not have sanctions on China specifically for the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims. If there were international sanctions, they wouldn't be coming from the UN, since China sits on the Security Council and would certainly veto any multilateral sanctions coming from the UN. I think that it is an issue we should all be paying attention to, but I'm not sure it is a salient enough. Well, let's see how to phrase this. I'm not sure states in general, not just the United States, act against their own economic interests in the promotion of human rights when the economic stakes are that big. I cannot confirm, though, that we don't have some sanctions on China for that issue, but I don't know of any. And I think it would be hard pressed to get a widespread support among the US population, because sanctioning China may result in those reciprocal sanctions. And that's going to hurt so many sectors in the American population. That's going to hurt businesses that do. I mean, so many of our businesses have relations with China. It's going to hurt your average low-income consumer if sanctions are resulting in lack of product availability. I mean, so many areas of the economy would be hurt. So while I think that diplomatic sanctions and widespread condemnation of that treatment and as much information as can be disseminated is necessary, I'm not sure that I would put too much stake in the US under any administration. This is not a partisan comment, but any administration to find it in their interest to sanction China.
Well, to that point, one of the questions in the book is, has the sanctions process become unaccountable to the American public and Congress, and is it in need of some reform?
Well, oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was a question. Oh, it was a question. I would say that yes, as with most issues, the process has become, the more it becomes bureaucratized, the less accountable it is to the public, and the less means of scrutiny we have at our disposal. I think that's the nature of bureaucracy, is bureaucrats are going to try to protect their job first, right? So it's going to be necessary, right? Any bureaucratic position is that, well, it's necessary. We have to increase the budget for it. And so unfortunately, yes, I do think it has become a means that we don't have much say over. But I think when it becomes highly salient to us, right, when there's a wide enough population that is burdened and hurt by the sanctions. I mean, just think about the trade war with China under the Trump administration. You could probably find someone that you know who has a business that had some type of hardship because of those trade relations. So once it becomes salient enough to us, right, we can vote with our or we can sanction or hold them accountable with our feet, right, by not voting the administration back in.
Earlier this week on NewsHour PBS, they had a segment on an American arms company, which was directly selling to the to the Russian technical armaments business. So is this whole thing about sanctions here just sort of a guise of something with great big holes, and it's really not effective at all?
Did the piece mention whether or not that company on the US side was being fined for that?
No. I mean, they were just selling things to a kind of ghost company in Russia, which then funneled these things to the industries that needed them in Russia, and they were selling them directly to them. So I thought, sanctions, this is just a big joke.
I think that speaks to the unaccountability question. The bigger the bureaucracy gets, the more politicized it can become, so that if you happen to be a big donor or have some connection to the government, this no longer becomes kind of a capitalist move. This becomes a crony version where the people that you know in government can keep you from being subject to the same penalties that someone else might be that was trying to do business in Russia or something else. I'm not sure what all the parameters are of the sanctions, but it seems like that would certainly be one that would fall under the current sanctions regime.
And I think this might speak to that as well. I was wondering how much the international commercial community is relevant to executing sanctions and how they're incentivized to fall in. If you were to look back to any of the major corporations, Siemens et al., they would have been vitally important had they been effective, but they were not utilized. How do you speak to that?
I would imagine that it takes a very strong oversight process and some international body with teeth willing to, if Siemens is breaking a multilateral sanctions, that breaking the UN. I'm not even sure that we have multilateral sanctions, because I think Russia would have just vetoed those if they came from the UN. So even that makes it harder, because what body is really going to sanction that company? Even though we're in a globalized world, we don't have a world government. The state is still sovereign. So that company, I'm not sure where is Siemens based in Germany. Okay. Just as an example. So Germany, the government of Germany would have to sanction or take it upon themselves to sanction that global corporation if the headquarters are there, or the US would have to have the political will and economic willingness to sanction Germany or sanction Siemens doing business in the US. And then that's likely to create tension between the US and Germany. That's likely to anger domestic populations in both countries that rely on doing business with that company. So I don't think the international political will and economic willingness is necessarily there. So I think that you highlight one of the problems of collective action. The Siemens can be a free rider. If everybody, all the other, and I'm not trying to single them out, just using them as an example. Yeah. This is why something like a commodity cartel is so hard to achieve, because any one group in any one country in OPEC can just deviate and be a free rider and sell cheap oil. So we have the same type of collective action problem at the international level for implementation of sanctions.
Do you think it's more effective to sanction an individual rather than a country? The country is so vast, but an individual you could really target, say an oligarch, you know.
I agree. I think the targeted sanctions that are trying to avoid widespread suffering and trying not to hurt civilians in the targeted country and are trying to also be very surgical. We can kind of think of a surgical strike, go in and hurt the regime, get the regime where it hurts. I think those are likely to be more effective as long as there aren't other sources of funding or I'm trying to think assets that the oligarchs, the targeted individual can call upon. Again, that's, I think, why multilateral in theory are going to be more effective, but then you have the collective action problem as well. One person deviates, one major country deviates, and then you're back to square one in some ways, except maybe why those financial targeted sanctions might have a higher success rate than other types of targeted or conventional sanctions is because the US has this dominance in the global financial regime for now.
So we are at time. I want to thank you all for some great questions. It is a very, very tricky issue. Certainly when we think of things like the Security Council, we can't always be very secure in the security of the Security Council. Or we look at smaller countries that I think have been subject to sanctions, but because they're smaller, the world doesn't look the same at them, like Myanmar, for instance.
Yes.
So there is no silver bullet and no easy way to do it, but the perseverance and the having a moral center when it comes to these things is definitely a big piece of it. So I want to give a big thank you for Gina Miller-Johnson. Thank you to all of you for being here week after week, participating. As I have said each week, this is such a phenomenal series that has been here. It was birthed in this community 70 years ago and is Great Decisions is a national series that has been ongoing, and it keeps going because people think that the issues matter, the questions matter, and that being in a room where we can actually have a discussion matters. And boy, howdy, do we need more of that these days. So thank you very, very much.